Agent Productions presents White Devil Podcast.
Hi everybody, welcome to White Devil Podcast, episode 10. Yes, we've done 10 of these. Can you imagine that? Today's topic is adventure games, and before we get to the topic, even if don't know anything about adventure games or something like that, please don't click away or stop the playback or whatever you're doing, because you're gonna have a chance to join in and enjoy this podcast. But it is a 10th not an anniversary, but our 10th podcast together, and so we have a very special group of guests. Let me introduce them. They're all familiar faces. First and foremost, of course, my buddy, Let's Play buddy, and also the Thunder from Down Under, Retro Kaiser.
I got my mouth full of candy right now. Sorry.
As eloquent as always. Then, of course, we have the evil mastermind of itstale.time.net, Sendu.
Hello, everyone. I hope we have a lovely time tonight.
And last, but definitely not the least, a behemoth of a guest. He talks enough for three. Please welcome the gaming beast, Dorabka.
What's going on there, sexy people and fellow beastians? Here's your one and only gaming beast.
Nice. So, indeed, this is the 10th podcast. This is a very special topic for the podcast as well. It's a topic that I've wanted to do ever since the third White Devil podcast. And before we get to the actual topic, I want to talk about a little bit the fact that, yes, indeed, this podcast sort of had its first anniversary already. I don't think you guys necessarily remember, but it was actually late July when I posted the first one. But, like last year. Can you believe that?
It's been a year now?
It's been a year.
Yeah.
Yep, we're all getting old.
So, yeah, and Kaiser was, of course, on the very first podcast, so how do you feel about that?
I feel old. Actually, no, I don't feel that old. It actually feels like time's flown by since then.
Yeah.
But a lot has changed. A lot of things have changed since that short period of time, or what feels like a short period of time. But it was fun doing that podcast with all the many attempts it took to record that darn thing.
Yeah. And I kind of did want to have like a kind of a reunion of the very first guests, which were you and Aqualung, but because of the topic today, I couldn't have him on here, Ken. So, but maybe he'll definitely be here again for some other type dealio. But then, of course, talking about this podcast and how it's developed, originally, the whole concept of it was that it was supposed to be a podcast about pretty much anything I felt like talking about, so there wasn't one specific topic I wanted to lock it down on. But this topic has been in the making for a long time, this particular podcast. And, well, Sendu actually does deserve part credit for the fact that White Devil Podcast is even a thing, because it was you who kind of impregnated me with the idea of making it.
Sendu, you are the father.
So I guess he's like the father of the podcast. I'm the mother.
I'm imagining, Hanu is on the Nostromo and Sendu is like the face hugger, and he jumps on him, and then out of his chest bursts out White Devil, like a little white devil bursts out of his chest. Says,
I see myself more as the old mentor than a father.
Okay, but yeah, the thing is, when Sendu suggested this idea to me, to go way back before the White Devil Podcast ever materialized, when he said that, you could, you should do a podcast, I think those were your exact words. Hey, you should do a podcast. And I thought, yeah, right. I was convinced that you were, if not wholly, then at least partly joking. And that was kind of funny because, because going back to those days when I was a guest on the Boot Chow, I always felt like when you did a podcast, and I've been a guest on a couple of other podcasts as well, but I've always felt when you were doing a podcast, you needed a certain type of host. You needed a certain type of energy to really be the host, and I didn't really see myself as that kind of person, because that's the thing about Gex Up, Keith, was that. Well, I'm paying him a huge compliment. Like, he had massive energy, like so much energy, like he was making sentences that made absolutely no sense. But he made everybody feel like a part of the podcast, and I felt like I'm not that kind of a guy talker, because as you might have noticed, and I still do it on this podcast, I like to be quiet, and I kind of like to just listen to everybody and things like that. I think I've more gotten involved because I kind of don't want there to be like those awkward silences. I try to get rid of those as much as possible. But yeah, I felt like I would be a terrible host for a podcast. But the more I thought about yes,
and that's when cocaine was introduced into his life to give him that nice buzz of energy.
Hey, come on! You suggesting that Gex was on coke? Please.
He was on heroin.
It's Diet Coke. But anyway, but the thing is, so when I did the first White Devil podcast, like, okay, I decided, okay, it has to be about a topic I really have a lot to say about, because when I don't have a lot to say about something, like, that's my, like, default mode. I'm just quiet and I listen to what other people are saying. So it had to be a topic I had a lot of passion for, so the Mega Man one was an obvious one. And then Kaiser, I'd gotten to know over time through Booch Out and It's Tell Time, and realized, hey, there's a huge Mega Man fan. Like, I gotta pull him on this thing. And of course, me and Ken, we had a much longer relationship involving Mega Man and, his videos and my cartoons. So, and then that first podcast, it went off without a hitch, really. Like, you guys hit it off. You and Ken hit it off really well, Kaiser. And, it went like really smoothly, and I thought, okay, but I still didn't think like this was going to turn into a running thing. So I started to feel the pressure, okay, if I really have to do another podcast quite soon after this one if I actually want to turn this into a regular thing. And that was, of course, the horror movie podcast. And Dorapka was there. That was Sendu's first time there. And Amuya was there. And Kaiser was there. So it was this lineup minus Amuya, basically, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Am I remembering correctly? It's been so long, I forgot.
No, it was this lineup plus Amuya.
Yeah, so basically, and that podcast was the first time it didn't go the way I planned. Okay, everybody had a good time, and I felt it was an okay podcast, but I felt a little like I really didn't get to talk about, we were really rushing at the end, we skipped a lot of things I wanted to talk about because it dragged out a little bit, and that time I felt a little empty at the end of it, like, was this really the thing I wanted to do? Because it didn't quite feel the podcast I wanted to do. But then I kept on getting on, and then the next one was the anime podcast, and that was Sendu, Kaiser, and Amuya. And you might remember, it's not in the recording, but when we stopped recording, once we were done with that, I actually did say this was the best podcast we've ever done.
I remember that.
Yes. And
mind you, granted, it was like 4 a.m. here, and I was very tired.
Which podcast again?
This was the third one when we did the anime.
Oh yeah, the anime one, right.
Yes, and
was I on that one? I think I was.
You weren't on that one. I had when we did the He-Man podcast, which is unique. You're the only solo guest I've ever had.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so. So I knew when I brought you back that you'd be a perfect solo guest because we had so much to talk about. And also the Beastcast, I was listening to that yesterday actually again, and it was weird like how it was just a weird experience. I recommend checking that. But it was I want to come back on Beastcast some other time.
Sure, man. You got like a infinite guest pass, so to speak,
As someone who was listening to those particular episodes that weren't on those recordings, all I can say is I enjoyed every single second of it. You two knew exactly what you're talking about, and you hit it off just like that.
Yeah,
Hanu, definitely, your He-Man stuff really well, and it's really enjoyable. I started watching He-Man again, the old cartoon, just so I can watch the reviews that you did, because they're quite interesting, because I don't want to, because there's a lot of the old episodes I haven't seen as a kid, so it's interesting.
Thank you. At least one person is doing exactly what I hoped people would do when they see my reviews of those episodes, because it wasn't like, oh, I want to make videos about He-Man, no, actually, I want people to go and watch He-Man. That's the whole point. But, yeah, but it feels like, some people watch...
We still still need to discuss the tragedy of Stinkcore more, so... And why Ninjor
we will make a we might actually do that later this year. We might actually do a follow-up He-Man cast.
The injustice that Ninjor wasn't.
Well, yeah, and Kaiser's cooking up something. I'm really excited for this. Yeah,
I know. Kaiser told me. Yeah.
But going back to White Devil for a little bit, like that third podcast is when I decided. And again, like the third podcast didn't go exactly the way I hoped. We talked for a really long time. But the stuff we talked about, it was like, I always prepare a list of things to talk about on the podcast. And we covered maybe 1/3 of the things we were supposed to talk about on that podcast. But I had so much fun. Everybody had fun. Everybody got to contribute. Everybody talked for a length of time. And it was supremely fun. So it was at that point I decided, okay, I want to keep doing White Devil podcast. So that was the point at which, in that third podcast, even though we've introduced other things like the match game, which sadly we're not going to do this time around because we got so much stuff we need to talk about, like, even though the podcast has kind of developed a lot since then, that third podcast is monumental. I feel that's the point at which White Devil podcast really became a thing. And then we did the follow-up podcast where we basically covered everything that I wanted to do. Like I knew because that's when I felt a little defeated after the horror movie podcast. Like, oh, we spent so much time and we didn't get to talk about everything. But that was like the first time I realized, okay, I'm going to save this part that we didn't get to talk about, and I'm going to save it for a future podcast. Like, I realized that's what I need to do. Like, there's always an infinite possibility for comebacks, and that's why we're going to do another He-Man podcast, and we're going to do another, whatever podcast. But, that's the only thing, like, I'm always, like, a little wary about doing immediate follow-ups. We've done, like, the immediate follow-up to the anime podcast. We've done an immediate follow-up to the heavy metal podcast. But I always fear, like, I don't want this to become just a heavy metal podcast or something or other, or just a gaming podcast because, I guess this is just because the way I am. I just want to talk about all kinds of stuff. But yeah, that's kind of. But yeah, we've had a lot of good podcasts. I always enjoy editing them and listening to them, and remembering like, oh yeah, Sendu said that, and Kaiser said that, and T McBee said that, and I got a whole line of new topics I want to talk about like in future podcasts. But yeah, this is kind of important. This is the 10th podcast, and I didn't believe for a second when I did the first one I was ever gonna be up to number 10. So I don't know. What do you guys feel about all that? I've been talking about it for like 10 minutes straight, basically.
I think in general, well, I just want to quick say, I had a blast doing the podcast, and you're definitely invited to the Beastcast, and I hope, also I'm invited to the next, some future White Devil podcast, if I can contribute in a reasonable way, if it's something that, I have no clue on or no interest, then yes. But
and that's another thing is when an invite is given. You always have this is the thing. Everybody, you don't have to be like, out of courtesy just say yes. You can anybody who is invited to the podcast, I won't feel offended if you say no, because if you don't honestly feel like you can contribute, like, don't force it. And that's the thing, is like and I will try to find another topic perhaps that you can contribute to, because because I don't take it for granted at all that you're willing to put away like 2 to 3 hours of your like free time on a Sunday to come and talk to me. Like, you can be doing like anything more constructive during that time. I don't take it granted at all, but I enjoy doing these immensely, and it's always an honor to have you guys on.
Oh man, thanks. That's cool.
One thing I am curious: have I gotten any better as a host? Because I don't feel I have.
I think you.
Look, man.
To be honest, you've stayed around the same, but you were good to begin with. That's all I have to say.
Well, that's a high compliment coming from somebody who was on the first podcast. Nice.
I must say, I think you have become better, and I think you've been pretty good, very consistent. Because if I remember my first podcast, man, they're rough. I cannot listen to them anymore.
I remember listening.
I mean, your accent was much even more stronger than it is now.
Yeah.
I remember listening back to the first ever Catcast, and oh boy.
I was also listening to I was on the Kaiser cast when we did the Welcome to Your Doom Jerkhead, and
yeah, that's when we talked
about the Mega Man cartoon series, and that was the one where you had the robot voice, appropriately enough.
That was just due to the bad recorder at the time.
Yeah, it was a little issue we had with the recorder at the time, but it's fixed now. But that was also a lot of fun. Like that was. It's kind of I kind of want to do those one-on-one reports, but that's the whole point of this podcast. Is also I want to get many people's different takes on things and conversations, and especially like, oh man, have you guys still listened to the previous podcast, the 9th one that was on video game movies?
Oh,
sadly, I think I did.
Sadly, with the way my internet situation is, I might as well be living under a rock. Living under a rock.
Yeah, Kaiser's internet situation has not improved. It's supposed to get better. What did you say? November or somewhere thereabouts?
November.
Yeah.
Eventually.
If you ever do another one based on video game movies, I would like to join that too. So I do have some opinions on that topic.
Yeah, I would have loved to contribute to that movie because it's a fun topic.
To that movie, yes.
Well, I recommend highly people to go check that one out because I was very much impressed. Well, everybody got a lot to say in, like even Sendu. But specifically, I was impressed with Joe's contribution. And whenever I have now decided that whenever I'm doing a movie-based podcast, I'm gonna have Joe on because Joe had a lot and like really actually profound things to say, and I was super impressed because I was a little worried at first that he wasn't really into it, but then like towards the end like he actually like he had a lot to say. So yeah. This is Joe, our own Joe from like It's Tale Time or Phoenix 8 Productions.
I just want to ask something because as I said I wasn't on that, but I was following it. I think I haven't listened to it yet because I didn't see that it was released yet, so I didn't see that for some reason. But I'll listen to it now. My question is one question I have is what you said you like Paul W.S. Anderson, so
yes.
Did you like the first Mortal Kombat movie?
Oh yes, absolutely.
There's some people that dislike it, but I think it's still one of the best video game adaptations.
It is. Yes, we talked at length about Mortal Kombat. Well, sort of. We end up touching upon it because it was really the first successful video game to movie adaptation.
Yes.
And I've also. Again, I'm hoarding my stuff. I have made a feature-length commentary you can actually watch with the movie on my second channel. So,
nice.
So if you want to check that out. But yeah, I'm a huge Paul W.S. Anderson fan anyway, so that's those movies are important. So his movies are always important to me. So
I have one question still. Is what did you think about the Street Fighter live-action movie with Jean-Claude Van Damme?
I'm in the camp who likes it. Like I have a lot of fun.
Yay! I like it too. I mean, yes, it could have been. The thing is, like
actually.
The thing is about the Street Fighter movies. The Chun-Li one is horrible, and the first one, yes, it could have been.
Up in the morning to you.
There's some things that could have been better, but if you see it as a Van Damme action movie, it's actually pretty cool. And they do a lot of the moves. Like yes, they don't do like the Hadokens and stuff, but anyway, I won't get into that. We can talk about this in another time.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
Kaiser actually, like we just before the podcast, we were talking with Kaiser. Kaiser only recently saw that, and I did that video long before the He-Man reviews this year. So, yes, Kaiser is living under a rock right now. So,
can I take?
Yes.
Can I have a turn now?
Sure.
I have stuff to say about that.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say I was not joking when I recommended it. I recommended you have a podcast because you always really confident in what you're saying. Just I've heard people who just kind of a lot and.
Okay.
And also, Joe is really Joe. He is really passionate about movies. He is always good at top. And now everyone's awkwardly silent.
I agree with you, Sendu.
It's Joe Marks,
Joe's a great.
Right?
I also thought that having Joe on the previous podcast, I would hope that we would have seen a little bit of that two guys in hats, that chemistry that you guys have with those Power Rangers reviews. Like I was a little.
If you had me on that episode, you would have had the three guys in their hats for the first time. We all have the same sort of hat.
Yeah, you all have terrible habits. Everybody knows you're not supposed to wear your hats indoors.
Hey. I gave that hat to Joe. His father said he's never seen a hat that better complements someone's personality.
All right.
I have
also
Joe's videos too, and he has a good opinion, and I think he's a good being a film buff or like more like a film fan. I would consider myself that I definitely agree with you guys.
And this is the thing about Joe. This is also the thing about Joe. The reason I had him on, and it was also a bit of a challenge on my part because I have not always, and it's okay. Like I haven't always agreed. I don't always agree with Joe's opinions on things, but I felt like he has enough insight that I felt that he could really like contribute to this. Like he would really have things to say, and I wish I wanted to create a constructive dialogue because, well, the one thing that you might have felt that at the start, I think a lot of everybody else was a little bit more uncertain of themselves, like Amuya and T McBee as well. But then as it went on, like it turned out like everybody had a lot to contribute. So and I think having Joe on helped that everybody felt a little bit more confident about what they had to say. Mm. Yeah.
That's another thing though. Like Joe and the Female Red, this podcast helped us meet new people in a way. Get to know each other better.
Yeah.
So like this podcast did introduce me to Lindsay the Red, and she was a blast to talk to. I definitely want to do more podcasts with her.
Yeah, and Lindsay was weird. Like that was a complete last-minute addition from Sendu, actually. So Sendu's become the lobbyer of like guests for this podcast.
Lindsay.
He's like the fiddling producer.
There we go.
He really is like the evil mastermind of It's Tell Time.
Lindsay, if you listen. Lindsay, if you listen to this, don't get offended, but you remind me of the female version of me. You're the female Kaiser.
I love how you said don't get
offended.
Hey, Lindsay
all I want to say about Lindsay... Well, sorry.
I said she was someone I've known for a while, and I knew she'd be a good guest. So I begged Hanu, I washed his shoes, I cleaned his car, so we'd let her on.
With Lindsay, all I can say is that she's a pretty good sniper in my drunk XCOM team. So
yeah, it kind of escalated though. Like after she was on that and legit, then she was also recommended to be on other stuff, and pretty much everyone who's had her on as a guest gets instantly impressed by her talking.
Oh yeah, she has a lot of energy, and there was one podcast we were trying to get her on, but then technical difficulties stopped her. I forget which one it was, and I felt it was the previous one, wasn't it? Like she was yes, because she was only around for the match game, and then her internet crapped out on her. So yeah.
All right, so let's all give Lindsay a round of applause.
We gotta have her on a future podcast.
Right,
yes,
right.
Everyone, let's give Lindsay a round of applause.
Oh yeah.
You too, Hanu.
Right. Anyway, I want to say I'll definitely check out the latest, the previous White Devil, because for some reason I missed the announcement because I have you subscribed. I'm subscribed, but for some reason I think I missed it. But
all right.
Anyway,
of course, I have a dedicated page for this podcast on my blog. That's TheHande.wordpress.com. So if you go there, there's a dedicated page with a list of all my podcasts. So you can just go there and you can find like everything. So
sounds awesome.
Oh, okay. Hanu, I actually have a funny story about the White Devil podcast.
All right.
This show has affected me so much. It has even invaded my dreams. Like no, it's nothing bad, nothing sexual or violent or anything. But it was just we were just in like a public library for some reason, recording a new episode of The White Devil, except in this universe, it was an alternate universe. It wasn't called The White Devil in this universe, it was called The Wet Devil podcast instead of The White Devil.
Now that sounds dirty.
No, you said it is like sexual, but seriously, yeah. Wet Devil?
Well,
speaking of like a porn
Devil,
title.
How come this podcast still hasn't even talked about where that name came from, that movie?
Well, there is an explanation of it, but I would assume people would have gotten it by now from all the teaser videos with Jim Carrey's face on it.
No, I'm saying, why not? Why hasn't this podcast reviewed said movie with Jim Carrey and other people that we don't care about?
That would be a waste of podcast, but...
No, it wouldn't. Everyone beat up on it.
We should probably do a Jim Carrey podcast at some point.
Ace Ventura, you could talk about the movies, the old cartoon.
We'll wait to do the Jim Carrey podcast when the next Dumb and Dumber movie comes out.
Oh yeah, that would be 2 perfect timing though.
Now, a question about that.
I'm dreading that because somebody's gonna probably cancel like at the last second, and we might have to move.
No. You shouldn't dread about the Jim Carrey podcast. You should dread about the follow-up, the Jim Carrey sequels podcast about Jim Carrey.
Now that would be a waste of podcasts.
Especially since I haven't seen any of the sequels.
You haven't seen Son of Mask or
no.
Evan Almighty.
I like Mask.
Evan Almighty.
No,
Ventura Jr.
Evan Almighty.
No, I haven't.
That sounds like really bad timing. I think, adventure games, right?
Okay, yeah, I'm thinking that we've been going on for almost half an hour about reminiscing about White Devil's past. So let's now move to the devil that is the devil you know, or however you want to put it. So when we come back, we'll break, and when we come back, we'll finally get around to talk about adventure games. And welcome back, everybody. So, finally we're getting to the topic of the day, which is adventure games. And also, the reason we're doing the Adventure Game podcast, I didn't actually go into it in the first part of the podcast, is that this is a topic that I've wanted to do for a very long time because a long time ago I made this horrible little video. It was called my top 5 bottom 5 game genres. And you may remember the top 2 game genres that I had there on there. Like, my first love, of course, is platformers. I love platform games, but equally much, I would say, it was number 2, but I would say I love, as much as I love platformers, equally as much I love adventure games. And I've been holding off on this topic for a really long time so that I would have the perfect guest lineup to talk about it. So finally we do, and those of you who do not know what adventure games are, first of all, let's start off with a small definition, because people may have heard the term, people may have some vague idea, but it's good to be precise. Okay, and also because adventure games are no longer kind of in the mainstream the way they used to be a long time ago. So this is also just a good reminder for everybody. What exactly are adventure games and what are they about? Okay, so
more than The Walking Dead.
So adventure games are games where the essential goal, if you will, is the progression of a story. That's kind of the main, that's the minimum requirement, if you will. There has to be a story, and the game is basically about completing that story, and frequently you are playing as, a character within that story, and there's usually some stake that you have in the events that go on. But basically, in order to accomplish that goal of yours, which is to get to the end of the game, if you will, you have to do at least one of these 3 things. And first and foremost is talking to characters, and there's a big parts of adventure games are having conversations with characters, getting important information, progressing the plot. The whole concept of a dialogue tree kind of comes from adventure games. I think I might be a little incorrect, but yes, that's kind of one big part of it. Another big part of it is you have to observe your surroundings. You usually have a certain set number of locations you have to go to, and you basically have to pick up anything that's not nailed down. That's kind of a big part of it. You have to go around picking up important items that will somewhere down the line, will help your character accomplish something. And the big one, the last one, and this is the absolute minimum requirement for something to be considered an adventure game. The main way you go about completing your goal is by solving puzzles. This can be anything from like combining 2 items to get a key from somewhere that you can reach, to convincing somebody that that you're talking to just opening a door. Anything that stands in your way is a puzzle, and you have to use creativity and a lot of brain work in order to figure out a way to get past it. So so even though some adventure games may include like action sequences, but they're not required. So the bare minimum is that you have to, at some point, to stop to think about a puzzle that is stopping you from achieving your goals. Okay.
And often they're quite funny dialogue in them.
Yes, that's one part of it. We'll get to that in a bit. Adventure games are a very broad genre. They've been around pretty much for as long as computer games have been a thing. So really, now it's time for a little history lesson, and then we're finally gonna move on to the actual topic to actually like discussing. But like the very earliest examples, I'm going to basically rattle off the basic subsets of adventure games. Basically, when this genre had it started, was in the late 70s when home computers started to become a thing. And the very first adventure games were text adventure games. Interactive fiction is a fancy word that they use for them, but mostly people will know text adventure games. And basically, you had these large paragraphs of text describing things to you, telling you the setting and what was going on, and you had to type in commands like telling your character to walk somewhere. But it was all text, and so you had to use your imagination. So these were very primitive games. Zork is kind of considered one of the grandfathers of this genre. There were others, but basically that was where it began, as text adventures. Then in the early 80s, there was a company that emerged called Sierra Online, and they introduced one of the most revolutionary things. It changed adventure games entirely. They introduced the concept of a graphic adventure game. So adventure games which had graphics, and they did this with a game called King's Quest. And King's Quest was very important. It completely, in effect, it kind of made the text adventure obsolete. And after that, they basically started using graphics to represent what you were seeing on the screen. But the term that you may also be familiar with is point-and-click adventure games. Those didn't come around yet. So in King's Quest, for instance, you were still using the keyboard to move around. You still had to type commands for your character to do stuff. So that was what an graphic adventure game, or an adventure game was, generally speaking, in the early to mid-'80s. The point-and-click adventure game, which I think is what most people will think when they think of adventure games, that only came about in the late 80s. And there were other early examples of it, but the one that most people will probably recognize as being the revolutionary title that made point-and-click adventure games the hot thing was when Lucasfilm Games, later LucasArts, released a game called Maniac Mansion. The reason why, by the way, if you're wondering why didn't adventure games immediately adopt the mouse as a standard controller, was because mice were, in the 80s, a mouse for a computer was actually more of an accessory. It wasn't exactly like a common thing, and it was only in the late 80s where it established itself. But yeah, that was the point after which people start to realize, oh, it's much easier to just have a bunch of commands on the screen, and then for you to go and click and, basically simplify all the gameplay to a mouse. And that was what started that development phase, and that continued well into the 90s and up to the late 90s. And then we finally come to the final subset of adventure games, which is kind of also one of the more controversial ones, was the move to 3D and 3D adventure games. And many people say that this is what kind of killed adventure games a little bit, because the genre kind of had a difficulty jumping in to that third dimension a little bit. And there were definitely toothing problems. But 3D adventure games, I would say they're one of the most versatile ones out there. But basically, it started with games like, for LucasArts, it was games like Grim Fandango, which used a keyboard interface. But then Sierra did 3D adventure games where you used a mouse. And but what basically happened was that in the late 90s, adventure games, whereas in the early 90s, and really before then, they were a major genre on the front of PC gaming, they kind of fell into the margin. So during that era is when adventure games kind of went down. And what happened was it was multitude of things, like small developers kind of stopped making adventure games. Sierra Online, which was one of the biggest, one could say the biggest developer of adventure games, they kind of went out. They went partially, at least, out of business. They stopped making games. There was a huge money laundering scandal that they were involved in, and the company kind of burned to the ground. And LucasArts, they of course had a huge stake in the Star Wars IP. And in the late 90s is when, of course, Episode 1 came out, and the Star Wars prequel trilogy started rolling, and the sales of Star Wars games started to become quite substantial. At which point they decided that, okay, I don't think there's much more money to be made on adventure games, and they effectively closed down that part of their game development. Most of those people later went on to form a company called Telltale Games. But now, in the 2000s, adventure games didn't completely go away, and games still came out, but they've kind of fallen into the fringes. They're no longer whereas in the 90s they were still popular with big distributors and everything. They've kind of fallen into the sidelines, but companies like Telltale, they started to find a way to get them still out through episodic releases. Digital distribution has sort of brought it back a little bit. We're still nowhere near the level it used to be, but adventure games still are around. The people who used to make them still are around, and through things like Kickstarter and things like that, they have slowly been making a comeback. And adventure games, and thankfully, like through web services like Steam and GOG, the old adventure games are also making a resurgence. So people now actually know more about them, because one of the reasons people, I think, forgot about adventure games for a long while was because the technology on computers was changing so rapidly in the early 2000s that a lot of those games would simply not run on modern computers. But that's where we are today. So those are the basic gist of these, and we're going to go around through this podcast. We're going to go through the major companies, and then at the end we're also going to talk about incidental bits and pieces, our favorite adventure games, our least favorite ones, whatever we come up with. But I think we have to start, if we're going to start anywhere, we're going to have to start with Sierra. Sierra was the company that made the adventure game a huge success in the 80s. They had the most game series and most adventure games like at all. They were a big production house, basically. People may forget about Sierra now because they're not around anymore, but they were a huge deal. And so it started with King's Quest. They also had games like Space Quest, Police Quest, so they were big on putting the word quest in their titles. But they had a lot of different... They had a broad range of games. And like Sendu mentioned already, these games there were more serious games, and then there were more comedic games. And so, first of all, let's talk a little bit about Sierra. And I know Dorabka has a little bit to say about maybe Sierra.
Yeah,
yeah.
So Sierra was always a big thing in adventure games. I remember it as a kid from my earliest memories of computer gaming were with Sierra.
Yes.
It's interesting. I think the first two Sierra games that I remember was our neighbor. I was friends with the neighbor girl when I was a little kid, even before like kindergarten age. And I remember they had a really obscure, back in the 80s, there wasn't just PC and Mac. There was a ton of different
computer brands,
computers with their own brands, and very different computers with very different graphics. And I remember the German company Siemens had one of their own computers at the time.
Nice.
Yes. They have stopped for a long time to make computers, but back then they were competing, and the computers weren't bad. And it wasn't made for gaming; it was made for business. But of course, every computer got their games. And I remember on that where her older brother would play this weird game called Police Quest.
Nice.
And I was familiar with computer and video games. So we didn't have our first console yet and stuff, or computer. So we just saw games at other people. And I remember Police Quest as my first true adventure game. And it was very interesting because I loved how you could walk around, talk to people, and investigate. And it felt like a movie to me, more like than other games.
Yeah.
Because before that, I played some games at a friend's computer. I think it was a Spectrum. I'm not sure if it was a Spectrum. I don't know. I know it was the earliest memories I have is from Frogger, Pac-Man, and Space Invaders, and another game that I still don't know what it is, but it was cool, but I forgot the title, sadly. But the point is that Police Quest was the first adventure game that I remember. And I love that, and I didn't really play it, I just watched him play it. And I only played it much later because it was cool because you are a cop and you're investigating a murder,
Yeah.
And already it has a lot of the Sierra style things that are very specific to Sierra, the way how they, talk, and also the Sierra, I think, invented the achievement system because for everything you do and in the game, you get points, right? And there's a maximum amount of points you can reach.
Yeah, that's a good interest.
So there's
yeah. It was a thing that they kept around for a really long time. It was they did have a score, but it wasn't used the same way as scores in computer games.
No, it was very different.
Normally, like what it was kind of what you were something kind of trying to make the top ranking list of something. But what Sierra kind of used it for was to show like your progress through the game, really. And like how much of the game you had completed, but also like when they started to get more into that, when they started to hide little Easter eggs and things in the games, then it became like an indicator. Oh, there's something you missed when you completed the game and you didn't get the full score because there was always a maximum for those.
Yes, and you could do things differently. Like in King's Quest, you could there's a dragon and you can either throw a knife and kill it, or you can use a different way to precede him. It's interesting because in adventure games, usually they always motivate you to use the non-violent way, And even if and it's not a fighting mechanic really, but it's where I feel like, as you said, one of the big things when people say adventure game, they toss the term around. Often they don't mean adventure games. They mean maybe action adventure, which is a really weird genre in many ways.
That's a good point, and I wrote a long blog about this a really long time ago, about adventure games, the term being kind of misappropriated a little bit, because it sounds like such a generic title, like adventure. What does that mean? The irony there, of course, is that it refers to a very specific subset of games, which is why I gave that whole definition at the beginning, so people know what we're talking about. But yeah, it gets tossed around a lot.
Yes, he wrote a long blog about that, which can be found at TheHande.wordpress.com.
Right, exactly. Yes. And basically, what I want to say is that Police Quest was cool because then I saw. Now I haven't played it through yet, sadly, and I know there's multiple Police Quests, and I haven't played every Sierra game yet, even the main series. But I always knew about them, and they always had there was always something you knew about them. If you knew gaming, that was something, and adventure games, you would always think Sierra and LucasArts, and it's like Marvel and DC when you think comic books, or it's the two big things, and they're different, but they're also similar. And the other game that I remember, one of the earliest memories, is my cousin had this really weird game called, and I'm not quite sure which one I saw first, Police Quest or this one, but this game was Leisure Suit Larry. And I was a little kid, so
I was wondering when we were going to get to Larry.
Leisure Suit Larry, and we played that on the Commodore 64, and
nice.
It was the way how it starts is great. It has this unique intro song, and it's Larry is if you know gaming, Larry is one of these iconic characters. I mean, maybe younger gamers don't know him, but if you're like in your late 20s, 30s, or 40s, you definitely know who Larry is, at least.
It was really the first iconic, like lovable loser character, if you will.
Oh yeah.
And a heck of a lot better than that Larry 8 Larry on the 360.
That's like decanonized now. That doesn't exist, so. It's like.
But speaking of C64, I assume that this must have been the first one, the Land of the Lounge Lizards.
The Land of the Lounge Lizards, right? This was the first one, and I still haven't played it through. And it's sad because I haven't played the other sequels yet, but I have it on GOG now because I didn't own it as a kid, but I haven't played it through yet, and I tried multiple times. I got far, but because I didn't want to use a walkthrough, but I'll talk about that later. The point is that Larry was an interesting game because for me, this was the first game that was like naughty, like it was like it has sexual content in it, and it had a way to it said like, this game is for adults. Are you sure you're an adult, right? And then we would type in we're 18, 20, we type it in, but we were like little kids. And it said no, and it was cool because it was in English, and we were in Hungary, right? And my brother and me were there, so we would translate. But the questions we didn't get the questions right. The weird thing is, I am freaking 32, and I still can't answer the questions because the questions were for an adult, apparently, from the 80s.
Yeah, that was the control, basically, that Sierra put in, that a certain age group of people couldn't really.
So to this day, I have to look at the online for the questions, and it says, when I fail the questions, it says, you're a kid, and I'm like, fuck you, game. Fuck you forever. That's like old school gaming.
From the sounds of it, from the sounds of this, from Leisure Suit Larry, it sounds like it would have been more suited for the Commodore 69.
Oh,
there we go.
Okay, good one.
Wasn't the first Larry remade like twice?
Yes, it's been remade twice. It's been
remade twice. Funny enough, this is a funny thing. The very first Leisure Suit Larry technically is a remake of an even older Sierra game, a text adventure game that was called Soft Porn Adventure.
When you buy there is a GOG bundle you can buy, which is the first 6 Larry games, and you get Soft Porn Adventure with that.
Yeah.
It's really cool. The only one you don't get is the latest remake. The
HD remake, Reloaded. Yeah,
I've got that.
Reloaded.
That's the one I was actually thinking to get because it reminds me a lot of 7. And 7 was like my favorite.
Yeah, 7, and they got the voice actor for Larry to come back as well.
And I played yet.
cool.
I haven't even played 2 yet, but I'm really excited to do so because I'm gonna finally finish that freaking game. But I love that to this day it's the stupid question and I can't answer it. And it's like
the question.
it's not one question. It's a ton of different questions, and some of them I can answer. Some of
name
them
one of
are
them.
like
Can you give us an example of what some of these questions are?
Wait. Let me. I have to
they're
open
all
up.
like questions about like who played this and
It's stuff about
so
political
character
stuff
TV
and whatever.
show that like had run like 5 years before the game came out. So
Exactly. So it's questions that if you were an adult in the 80s, you would know. Anyway, Larry.
But the Larry games, well, I was hoping that we would get to Larry a little bit later in the podcast, but yeah, the Larry games are one of the few game series that I know actually a lot about from Sierra, because those Sierra guys, for some reason, they're a little bit more secretive than the LucasArts guys about like what they were up to during that time period. But these games were made by a guy called Al Lowe, who was who was first of all a professional musician, former high school teacher, and he didn't, for the death of him, believe that Larry was ever going to be a success. He put that game together in a very short amount of time, and he thought that he basically wasted his time. But he basically like became one of the gurus of Sierra, and he had creative control over all the Larry games ever since. And it's funny, like it's one of the biggest cheats. Like the reason that game became very popular was because of, like you said, the naughty content. But everybody thought that it was a game about sex. Like that was the whole big thing about it. And it's really not. It's actually.
Well, that is Larry's ultimate goal.
Yes.
The only sex that I always remember, at least from the first one, because I haven't played it through yet, is when little spoiler here. There is like this really kind of this old, this prostitute that you need to get laid, and the funny thing is, little spoiler here. If you don't use a condom, you have to go and buy a condom. Then your dick basically explodes and you die.
Yeah.
So, but if they actually have sex, all you see is like the word censored and it's moving up and down.
Yeah. I mean, that was the whole joke. That was the whole joke, that the game just teased you with it. But all it was just a comedic adventure game with, a lot of like immature comedy and jokes, which is funny because I've read quite a few interviews with Al Lowe. Like, he's a fascinating guy, and I recommend reading one of them. But he actually, like, every Larry game, every joke in a Larry game, whenever he had like reservations, like, am I going too far? He would ask his wife. So. So every joke in a Larry game has been approved by Al Lowe's wife, basically. So
honestly, Larry
is talk about the iconic catchphrase, the theme song, the name of which, by the way, is "For Your Thighs Only." Actually, Al Lowe, he composed that. He actually made it himself. So, like I said, he was a professional musician. So yeah,
right.
You didn't say that.
I want to say that the cool thing is about Al Lowe, he seems like a funny guy, and it's here's the, I don't know if this is the, Larry.
And he still runs a Larry website to this day that has a lot of like a lot of design concepts and things like that. So you want to check that out. It's called Al Lowe's Comedy Site or something like that. You could type it on Google, you'll find it easy enough.
Here's some of the questions.
The one thing about Larry, and this is something I want to talk about, you mentioned like Police Quest that in those games you often had multiple solutions to puzzles. So that was forward thinking of them, and that was actually that's one thing why I think Sierra games became very popular, because they had these colorful worlds. They always had a healthy dose of comedy, I think. Always with the King's Quest games and the Space Quest games.
Yep. Especially Space Quest and Larry too. I mean,
yes,
but every one of them had
but then you did have more serious games like the Police Quest one, and
that's like about murder and stuff. So it's very different.
So I think that's what's part of the reason why they became so popular, is that people had. They had a lot of freedom with those games to go and do what they want. We tend to think of adventure games, I think, a lot of times as very linear games, and yes, they are. But you had a lot of liberty even in games back then with those. And in Larry, like, you have a lot of different goals you can accomplish while you're playing as well. But one thing, though, it also relates to that.
Yeah, baby.
Those questions about like how old are you, as an age control measure for Larry 1, but. Also, they did do something, the Sierra games, which they're rather notorious for, and that was that they would punish gamers for even the slightest little fuck up. Like, all you have to do in Larry 1, if you walk off the sidewalk, you get immediately run over by a car.
Oh, I remember that.
Every Larry game except 7.
7 and 4, I mean, 7 and 4 or 7 and 5 are
okay, but
you couldn't die, but that was the Sierra trademark, where the frivolous deaths, if you will.
I remember in Space Quest, I played the VGA remake for Space Quest 1, and that is quite a challenging game. Like, I want to play the original games, but the early Sierra games are they're like the in-between between the text adventure and the full graphic point-and-click adventure, where you had already a character and you could move around.
Graphic adventure game just means it has graphics. So if it has graphics, it's a graphic adventure game. But like that's the thing I was getting.
Well, okay.
That point and click is kind of just a subset of graphic adventure game, if you will.
Exactly. But to be fair, that there's text adventures that had graphics like pictures in them, but I would still consider them pure text adventures.
Yeah.
I would say graphical adventures is like the next step, where you could actually move your character around with the crosshair. But you still had to type in your commands. So that's what I first grew up with.
Yeah, that was.
And then was the next evolution was the point and click, which has stayed to this day. The only thing that has changed is the way how they do the point and click, but it's still the same. It's still the same basic concept.
Sort of.
And the graphics.
Sort of. We'll get into the development of point and clicking, if you will.
Right.
But to get back to like the earliest Sierra games, and like what you were saying about especially that era of gaming, in the early graphic adventures where you controlled the character with the arrow buttons, and you still have to type commands. But then also the added challenge that if you knew that if 1 pixel of your character, for instance, went into the stream in King's Quest, you would drown. So that kind of stuff. The frivolous deaths.
It's old school gaming. Yeah, that's something that Sierra did.
And I think the reason for it was that you admitted that you haven't finished the first Larry game, which it's actually a very short game once you get down to it. But I think the reason for those frivolous deaths, part of it might have been like entertainment value. Like with Larry, definitely, I feel that there's a lot of entertainment to be had.
Hey,
you feel bad for Larry when bad stuff happens to him, but you also kind of laugh. But it was also, I think it was
is on a dog.
What?
I saw that.
Yeah.
Reloaded is I want to play the 6th game. One of you give it to me.
Okay, but the thing is, like, I think that was a way to kind of extend the amount of time that players were going to.
Exactly. Yes, it was the same reason why they did the early video games in general. It doesn't matter if it was a platformer, adventure game, strategy. It doesn't matter what it was. They were made extremely challenging because the space, the computers, they could do a lot already. Well, not as much, in comparison it's like, primitive, but one thing they lacked in early times was space, hard drive space or disk space. Yeah. So they could only make the game so long or so big, so they had to make it more challenging in order to expand the time of the game.
It's also adapted from the arcade thing. In arcades, they wanted games to be difficult, so people would have to be playing them.
Yeah,
that's another thing, yeah.
But that was like the whole thing, is you would make one game and you knew that it might take another year before the next installment came out. Because once they got very popular, of course, that's why Sierra was able to, eventually they made like tons of different series of adventure games. Like it wasn't just the Quest games, there were tons of ones that only maybe had 1 or 2 installments that maybe they didn't take off quite so well. But generally speaking, like Sierra became like the big production house of adventure games. They became the kind of the first home of adventure games. But yeah, and also what you're saying about Larry, the whole age control issue, it goes into another thing is that like later Sierra adventure games also start to have a lot of points where you were basically told to look at the manual to answer a question in the game, because piracy was like rampant in the computer scene in the late 80s and early 90s. So as a kind of a anti-piracy measure, a lot of adventure games were designed with those kinds of fail-safes to make sure that if you had an illegal copy of the game but you didn't have the manual, then you basically could never complete it.
Well, the idea was that exactly as you said, but it wasn't just adventure games. Pretty much every game, especially computer games, because it was easier to pirate those, because that was the whole reason Nintendo said we use cartridges, not discs,
Oh yeah,
also because they load faster than discs. But the point is that they said that you cannot pirate But of course, the Russians and the Chinese have proven them wrong, many,
Yeah.
and still do.
And the funny thing is Larry became hugely popular because of that whole naughtiness aspect of it. It was also very popular because of the rampant piracy. Like Al Lowe actually did say that they sold more copies of the Larry 1 hint book than they sold actual copies of the game. So, so when he did the Kickstarter for the remake for the first game, he actually made a joke like, "Well, we didn't intend it, but we invented shareware by accident."
Yeah, he has. I gotta see that because he's got a point. Because as I said, I think this
Hello.
Sierra also I think they also invented the achievements with the points, which is a huge deal, especially when you
make
think
a fair
about
point about that, actually. Yeah. Like myself, like I know a lot. Like I say, they become a big production house, but really it started with two people, which were Ken and Roberta Williams. So it was this married couple basically that started Sierra. But as time went on, the company became bigger and bigger. They became one of the market giants basically.
Right.
For a period of time, and they also distributed other people's games. Not just their own.
No, they also distributed other games, but
yes,
it's like
but the adventure game wing was very strong all through the 80s and early 90s, and it was only in the late 90s when all that terrible stuff started to happen to them. Like after Ken and Roberta had basically left the company as well.
When left the company and they are not. They're retired, and. Yes. But Roberta Williams actually, she would pose on multiple of the like the packaging of the very early games. You know, like there was
including soft porn adventure.
Soft porn adventure. She was actually quite a looker, I must say, actually. And well, it's true, whatever.
Okay.
It was kind of weird. She was also in Mixed Up Fairy Tales or something like that.
Okay.
Wow, they got the original also.
Okay, but it's like my experience. My experience with those '80s Sierra adventure games. I don't have as much, but does somebody have an '80s Sierra game that? Because my experience is more from the '90s. So does anybody have an '80s Sierra game they want to talk about? Yep.
I'm not really old enough. The earliest proper adventure game I played was an educational Carmen Sandiego game.
Yeah, that was.
They made a ton of those. They made at least like 10 or 20.
Like Carmen Sandiego in Finland, it wasn't like such a big thing, but yeah, I only just recently, and it's actually through you, discovered that was a thing with Sierra, that they actually did those.
Yeah. Looking back, it's Carmen Sandiego is quite a creepy game. Because you got traveling around the world to look for a pretty attractive woman, you almost feel like a stalker in a way.
Yeah.
It was Carmen Sandiego's Great Chase Through Time. That's what I'm talking about.
All right. But has anybody like played one of those early King's Quest or Space Quest games?
I played Space Quest. I played King's Quest.
Okay, Kaiser.
Yeah.
Just recently, I got a PC bundle, which there's a whole ton of them. They're most of them are pretty good, but one of the games that came in them was an old Sierra PC adventure game called Gold Rush.
Prove it.
Where
All right.
Shut up, Sendu.
What about Gold Rush? Yep.
Damn, Sendu threw me off. It's a game. I haven't played much of it, so I can't really say. But all I know. Play of it so far is it's one of those text adventure ones where you have to be very precise.
Oh.
And not like a point and click with text. For commands, like one of those kinds. Sorry if I spread any confusion there.
Okay.
But it's very
So what's the setting on that one? Can you tell me what the setting is on that one?
The good old-fashioned Gold Rush.
So it's the Old West, basically.
It's like a Wild Western, yeah.
Oh, cool.
Except you sort of start off in the city, sort of traveling down.
Ah, okay. Interesting.
But it's one of those things, if you type in a dirty word like fuck or shit, it says, I do not know what that means.
Oh, yeah. Well, basically like any command that they don't know what it means. So nobody has played like an really old school King's Quest, because I haven't. The closest thing I've ever gotten to it, and this was from the Brothers chaps, the people who made Homestar Runner. They basically made a little tribute to King's Quest. It was called Peasant's Quest, And it was like an entire lengthy like Sierra graphic adventure game in a Flash browser, basically. Like you couldn't save your game, so you had to actually beat the whole game in one sitting. And I did do it, but I confess that I did it with the walkthrough open in another window. So
I think with these games, I want to say this: I played the original King's Quest, and the funny thing is, I have a little bit of an issue with the whole, typing and for the commands.
Yeah.
Because like I'm a huge retro gaming fan. I really am, and for me, graphics, old school graphics, I like them. They look cool, and I'm not like a snob like that. But the one thing that I have a little bit of an issue with is certain old school controls that I have a hard time going back to, and one of them is the time for commands, because it's like often you'll say you know what to do, but you have to type the exact word because they couldn't put in that many words into the code.
And also the press forward once to start walking, press forward again to stop walking thing.
Yeah. So the thing is that there's something they had actually made remakes.
Yeah.
And
oh yeah, the VGA remake of the first Larry is entirely point and click, by the way. So yeah, it didn't have the. It's called the text parser, is what.
Hey,
yeah.
Hey, both the original Larry and Reloaded are on GOG.
Yeah, I know.
What I wanted to say is, what I wanted to say is with King's Quest is that I did play through the first 3 King's Quest, but they made different remakes also. Sierra did, but there was a fan remake. There's a program that I wanted to talk actually later about, but I'll talk about more. It's called Adventure Game Studio, and it's a game-making software that in the 90s and the early 2000s, I think it came out in the early 2000s, and it helped actually to reinvigorate the adventure game scene, because a lot of people started making games, and there's now entire series made with that has been sold and have been successful. But I'll get into that later. But the thing is that somebody made a really good, very close, like one-to-one remake of the first 3 King's Quest, but in the Super VGA and with a point-and-click interface.
Oh,
and
nice.
that's really cool because it's still, and I was able to.
A lot of work, I would imagine. Yeah.
It was a lot of work, and it looks like basically like King's Quest 5, basically style graphics.
Nice.
And
speaking of.
Yeah.
I was going to say, speaking of King's Quest, I've actually played the Master System port of it.
Nice.
There was a Master System port.
There was some weird ports for King's Quest.
Did it have a save game? I'm curious now.
I didn't play far enough to figure out. I
might
just
have
got
a
very
password
frustrated.
system.
I got very frustrated with all like the cheap deaths. Like if I tried walking.
But how? How did it have a? Did it have like a? It couldn't have had a text parser interface though.
No, you moved. It was more like the point and click adventure ones, but you actually moved the character. You moved the character with the controller instead of clicking and pointing.
Okay, yeah.
Or pointing and clicking. But the thing that frustrated me about the game was all the cheap deaths. Like if I had to walk, I had to walk like 1 pixel away from the pond. Otherwise, if I took 1 step forward, I'd just fall in and drown.
Yes. I mentioned that. I already mentioned that.
Yeah.
And but yeah, that's the whole thing. I have to concur with Dorobka on the whole text parser issue, and I have a hard time getting into those games just because of that. It's not Sierra, but I played a long time ago. I've played a couple of installments of the Hugo series, which is another graphic adventure series with text parser commands. And I think they were only demos. I don't think they were full games. But yes, I remember those very vividly and having a hard time with those making any headway. Yeah.
And basically, what I'm saying is that there was these fans made the remakes. There's like the first 2 was made by one group, and then the third one was made by other one, and it even has voice acting and stuff. So that was really cool. Yeah. They went all out, and it's a free game. All 3 of them, and there was actually somebody was working on a 4th game, but that fell through.
Yeah, and I do wish that I really would want to give one of those games a try and actually beat one of them, so I could really feel like I've actually done it, because like I said, the closest I've gotten was Peasant's Quest, which
right.
Which
okay, this is interesting.
Okay,
this is interesting. Sorry, this is interesting. It was ported to the Master System by Parker Brothers, the people who released board game.
Well, Parker Brothers, they were involved with the different things. The point is that with King's Quest...
This must have been a later, like, I'm looking at the picture right now you sent me, Kaiser, and yeah, this must have been a later Master System because the cover art...
It says 1980. It says 1989.
What I want to say is with King's Quest is that I find I really like and enjoy King's Quest, but I'm playing now the fourth one, and it's a little bit, where I'm having some trouble, but it is where it was just on the cusp of point and click. Like the graphics are already really cool, really neat.
Yes.
And I love the world of King's Quest is very interesting because it combines a lot of different fairy tales into one, and because
Sierra is definitely like a soft target for people like myself who have gripes about the games, but actually like Sierra's is ubiquity the correct word? Like it was all around. Is that the correct word?
Ubiquity? I forgot.
The prevalence of Sierra adventure games, I think, was one of the big reasons why adventure games were so big in the 80s and 90s. So they did do a huge service to the genre in general, even if they were not necessarily the best of games at times.
I think the thing was Sierra made a lot of games, and some of them might have not been as great as the other ones. But I will say this: that Sierra, in comparison, they have made series that are legendary. Another series that I started playing a little bit in recent years, but I need to really get into it, is where they experimented with combining their typical adventure game format, because that's when with their point-and-click adventure game format with role-playing games, which is one of my favorite genre. I know it's not yours, but definitely one of mine. I played more role-playing games through than I played adventure games.
Yeah, what game was that?
It was the Quest for Glory series. Originally, it was supposed to be called Hero Quest, but there is a board game that I'm a big fan of, and what happened is they made a video game adaptation of Hero Quest. It was very popular, actually. Gremlins did it and the point is that there was a lawsuit because of that, and they had to change the name from Hero Quest to Quest for Glory.
Okay.
And it's basically a fantasy adventure, point and click adventure, but there is actually fantasy combat, and you can get experience, and you can choose between 3 classes, which is like you can choose between a warrior, thief, or mage class. So it has combat in it, but it's like, imagine you play an adventure game and literally they stuck on RPG elements to it, so it's interesting, definitely.
Yeah, Quest of Glory, like, it's both kind of well liked, but also a little notorious because of some of the later installments I've heard. But but maybe a couple of more games that we can talk about. We've mentioned the Larry series. Does anybody have something more to say about the Larry games?
Sorry to go back to Kings.
Thanks for the game that you just sent me.
Hey, what happened to Lust in Space? Why'd that get canceled?
I think it got canceled because Al Lowe left the company, but it's
I really
it was around that time when Sierra was kind of headed into trouble. It's because it was the next adventure game. I might be wrong, but I think the next game that came after Larry Love for Sale, Larry 7, is was the 8th King's Quest game, and that was the 3D one that didn't do so well.
That was controversial. But you know what the funny thing was? That was the first King's Quest game that I played.
Yeah.
But it's
Speaking of King's,
Larry 7. It's just that in Larry 7, they kept talking about these areas are for 8, Lust in Space.
Yeah, it was probably just an in-joke. Maybe Al Lowe did intend to make that, but he left the company before the production ever started.
Oh, yeah, he did intend to. I saw a bit of it. It was supposed to be the first 3D Larry game.
I got a question. What happened to the 4th one? Why is that one missing?
There's a joke behind that.
The joke, of course, is the Larry 4, the Lost Floppies. Which
it's quite literate yet.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery, and many people there are many various theories about it. It seems to me like Lowe might have slipped out, that it was just literally supposed to be an in-joke, but there are like various rumors that there was a canceled Larry game, and then there's the story about like Al Lowe losing the floppies for the 4th game. That seems to be just a complete in-joke. Like that's not the real reason why there's no Larry 4. And there's also some some theory about the fact that the way Larry 3 ends is that he finally gets like a steady girlfriend, which is Passionate Patty. That they needed a way to kind of segue into a new Larry hitting on other women adventure, which is the 5th one. Which I always end up calling Larry 4. Like, in my mind, I can't register the fact that it's 5, but I have no problem calling Larry 6, or Larry 7, Larry 7.
Yeah.
And also, do you have a problem? Do you have a problem calling the 360 game Larry 8?
No, because that's the title. It's Magna Cum Laude.
Okay.
That's a spin-off game. I don't count that as in the main series.
But they put in a joke. They did put in a joke about Larry 4. It's actually like it plays on the other Larry's computer because it's a different Larry. So that's another thing. It's the nephew of the original Larry. So
it's like going from Saved by the Bell to Saved by the Bell and the next generation or something like that.
Yeah, but the thing is. Let's talk about the Sierra Larrys. Like, have you got my personal favorite? I have to concur with Sendu. Is the 7th one, and I also have a soft spot for the 6th one, and also like the VGA remake of the first game. I really like, which is why I really don't like 2 and 3 because they have the text parser commands. I've tried to get into 5, which is the 4th game, but I haven't really gotten around to it.
Well, I haven't played the other one simply because I want to play it in sequential order, even if it kills me. But one thing that I probably will do, what I do with adventure games nowadays, because one of the things that I wanted to always get more into adventure games, but one thing that always kept me back is that I guess I got stuck at one puzzle, and I just couldn't figure it out for the life of me, because some of them are really like they were thinking to do that, and the point is that you get stuck, right? And that's one of the biggest. Every genre has its strengths and weaknesses, and one of the weaknesses of adventure games is that, since especially the more old school ones, since the difficulty level in a sense where you need to figure out what to do and you need to really think, in at times really abstract ways out of the box. Yeah. And sometimes it makes sense, but sometimes you sometimes I knew what to do. But the way how they wanted me to do it was the weird way.
Yeah,
shoot, Hanu, Outlaw actually did finally say what happened with 4. Yes, he just had a really hard time making 4 after how 3 ended, and decided why not just skip that intermission.
Yeah, and that's a whole big in-joke in the 5th game is that Larry has amnesia. But, or 5th, Larry 5, which is the 4th game. Yeah, that you see, this is why
they pulled a naked gun
as well.
They pulled a bit of a naked gun.
It's a great in-joke. I don't think any game series has ever done that, but I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. But yeah, I think the 7th one was my favorite also because that's one of the 2 Larry games where you can't die, so you have the freedom to go around solving the puzzles really. But also, Dorobka, I sympathize with you. Sierra was occasionally really bad at dropping those hints that you needed to really get the puzzles. So
it's not just Sierra; it's a lot of adventure game.
But yes, Sierra in particular, and for a company that did them for so long, it's kind of it was kind of a bad sin for them. Is there something you add to this, Kaiser? Yep.
I was just saying about the joke being. I'm gonna name the 4th Retro Kaiser the game. Retro Kaiser the game 5. What the fuck happened to Retro Kaiser the game 4?
Yeah, it is a very unique joke. Like I don't think any other game series has done that, honestly.
But another thing I wanted to say was going back to King's Quest. I'm actually quite impressed that King's Quest 5 was ported to the NES.
Was it?
Yeah.
Wow, you know a lot more about Sierra ports than I do.
No, I just found it accidentally while searching on eBay, seeing what it got ported to, and I posted a link in the chat somewhere. There was also a Mega Drive game as well, which I'm interested in playing these now.
Yeah, but probably didn't have the voiceover that the PC version did, but
I just
probably
want to say also with the Sierra games and everything is that I do know of games that have been much worse with the. I have an example that I want to talk about later on. So
okay.
How bad it was.
Well, I think we need to wrap up if we're going to get to other companies. So one more series that I would want to highlight. It was a short one, but it was great while it lasted. Was the Gabriel Knight series.
Oh yeah.
By Jane Jensen, who actually started work on, I think it was the 5th or 6th King's Quest game, but she then came to her own. She made there was Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers in '93, The Beast Within from '96, and then the final one, '99, Gabriel Knight 3, Blood of the Sacred, Blood of the Damned. Probably one of my favorite adventure games of all time. Also the first game of the series I played, confusingly enough, but it made me enough of a fan that when I discovered that GOG was a thing, you knew damn well that I was going to download those other games and finally play. Yeah.
You know, when I first heard the name Gabriel Knight growing up, I thought it was somewhat of a spin-off of King's Knight. Because come on, a spin-off of King's Knight, King's Quest, Gabriel Knight. Does it sound like a Royal Knights of the King?
I just want to say one thing.
has a bit of a thing. He doesn't want us to give spoilers for these games.
Yeah. That's what I want to say. I just started playing Gabriel Knight. Now I had to have a big break.
Okay, so I'm not.
But I already liked it. I found it interesting.
And also because I want to quickly wrap up this. We don't want to get stuck on Gabriel Knight. Let me just suffice to say, me and Retro Kaiser did a Let's Play of the second game. I highly recommend checking that out.
Well, that's also, why I'm playing the game so I can watch
Just to give people the gist of the series, it's a paranormal detective series about this New Orleans author called Gabriel Knight, and he goes on different adventures. They all have their own little supernatural side to them. They also include a lot of real historical detail in their plot, so they're very interesting in that way. And the second, and they're all very different. Like the first game is traditional pixel art 2D animation, so it's very much like in the mold of the old Zero Adventure games, but it is fully point and click. There are moments in the game where you can die a little unexpectedly, but it has a lot of content, a lot of high quality voice acting and music, and it's great stuff. The second game is a FMV heavy game, and you will see that with Retro Kaiser, but a very competently made, really good adventure game. The third one is in 3D. It splits opinions, but in my view, it's one of the best 3D adventure games as well that has ever been made. So
one thing from the little that I played, I already like that they got the very talented actor Tim Curry as the voice for Gabriel Knight. So they got for a video game, they got a pretty high caliber cast.
Yeah, Tim Curry he was well known, but he wasn't as super famous, I guess, when they did that. But yes, definitely. And he also
for a video game,
yes, and he also voiced Gabriel in the third game. In the second game, he's played by because it was live action, they needed a different actor for it. But Dean Erickson, well, what did you think, Kaiser, compared to Tim Curry? Was Dean Erickson, did he cut the mustard?
Cut the mustard.
I thought he...
Yep. What?
Thank you, Cindy, for completely derailing my train of thought. No.
Sorry, Uncle Kaiser.
I mean, what did you think of Gabriel in the second game? Did you think he lived up to the legend of Tim Curry?
The acting was decent. Shut up! I'm trying to talk. The acting was. I'm just gonna say the acting was good. I can't continue on with
it had
Cindy
a lot
bothering
of
me.
inherent comedy in it. And another Sierra game, very, very quickly to talk about, Phantasmagoria. It came out before Gabriel Knight 2, but it was also another
that game got banned in Australia.
Yeah, it got banned. It's a very notorious game for an alleged rape scene in the game. I would say that the game is much better than its reputation would let you on. It's a supernatural horror adventure game. Again, with FMV live actors. The live action tech is a bit more primitive, and perhaps that's probably its biggest weakness. But it has great mood and atmosphere, and also I think it's a very clever adventure game. Also, it has a built-in hint system, which I actually appreciated very much. It's a very cool one at that. But yeah, it got quiet. Yep.
No, I just want to say quickly about the FMV era is that there was an era, especially in adventure gaming and in gaming in general, where everybody was excited to do FMVs, and they thought that's going to be the future of gaming. So, and Phantasmagoria was one of those games that I haven't played it yet, but Spoonie has made a famous Let's Play of it, but I actually want to play it first because I am interested. And as a kid, I remember that was just cool because I loved movies and I loved video games, and I thought because there was an entire subset, you know how they interactive novel, and they called that interactive movies, but really it's an adventure game.
Personally, I'm not a fan of that interactive movie moniker because I think it betrays, or I think it's
definitely. It was just the name. It was just a word. It was a
buzzword. Honestly,
because it makes the game seem more passive than it really is, because you do actually have a lot to think about. And Phantasmagoria is interesting because Roberta Williams was again the mastermind behind that one, and she got the inspiration to do it from another adventure game that was called The Seventh Guest. But I would say like amongst the FMV heavy adventure games, like Gabriel Knight 2 and Phantasmagoria actually stand as really good games. So I highly recommend those. But
to be continued.